firing up. My participant count is firing up. We're over 250 already, and it's going crazy. We're expecting about 500 people today, which is good, maybe over, which is fantastic for these sessions. If it's your first time, welcome to a SITFA webinar talking about fraud today, particularly procurement fraud, and whether or not it is procurement fraud or poor contract management. We're going to give a bit of time for people who are joining late, so not too long. I can see we're already at 362 participants, which I think is amazing. So we'll give them 30 seconds or so, and we'll crack on. With that volume of participants, you can understand that we can't be as interactive as we may be with a smaller group. We will be monitoring any questions or comments that you raise in the Q&A box, the Q&A facility within Zoom. We have disabled chat just purely because of the volume and the number of notification alerts that people will be getting, and we wouldn't be able to physically monitor. But if during the course of this session you do have a question you would like answered, or would like us to discuss or even take away afterwards, then feel free to pop it in the Q&A box. We are recording. There are some slides that will be made available in a follow-up email to all participants. As I say, the session is broken down into individuals. I'll introduce you to some colleagues that are participating as panelists today, and the panelists will each have their own session and maybe some slides to share with you. But what we will do is leave sufficient time at the end to look at any questions that you've raised, and to actually have a more interactive discussion, maybe between the panelists, but on the topics and the issues that you raise. We obviously don't expect to cover everything in 1 hour in one lunchtime session. Wouldn't that be great if we could? But as I say, we'll cover as much as possible. We can always run follow-up sessions. This has been one of our most successful, in the sense of the number of participants that have asked to join and have been sent invitations. We're already over 400, so I'm going to crack on now. As I say, we're talking about procurement fraud and poor contract management, and it's been the bane of any fraud manager's existence when it comes to having to deal with report procurement fraud and risks when they're working in an organisation, because in its normal entity, procurement fraud is very, very difficult to detect using data analytics and available information and the likes, as opposed to other areas of fraud and risk that you may deal with in your day-to-day work, where you have a wealth of data. And procurement fraud is sometimes the most difficult to investigate, to evidence, and to take appropriate action on. So there is an emphasis on prevention, in my mind, around procurement fraud. But that leads us into the conversation of what is procurement fraud, or actually what is considered to be procurement fraud by many, but is actually poor contract management, where you've got individuals that are not experienced and knowledgeable around managing contracts, that are left with the responsibility just because of their job title and the area they work in, and they don't follow the appropriate controls to prevent fraud. To talk about this today, we have on our panel, in addition to myself, I'm a senior consultant with SITFA. My background is public sector, local government for over 22 years, working in counter fraud, mainly in London, and dealing with corporate fraud teams, managing corporate fraud, which encompassed internal issues, procurement fraud being a massive risk to an organisation, both not just from those outside of the organisation that would like to commit fraud, but sometimes from those inside. We have with us today Mike Fagan, who is an Assistant Director in Birmingham City Council. Birmingham City Council, the reason we've asked them to participate today, As you can imagine, as an organisation, they are actually the largest metropolitan borough in Europe. They have a budget of £1.6 billion annually. Now, Mike will tell you about his history with Birmingham, what he's currently doing now, but obviously he's responsible for a part of that budget and what happens in the authority. And we have our SITFA's solicitor and principal procurement advisor, Mohammed Hands, who will talk about procurement and procurement fraud in particular. Just as an overview from me, for the purpose of this and for the slides that you'll get afterwards, I've sort of tried to detail what action fraud puts procurement fraud as. And as I say, it's any fraud related to an organisation purchasing goods, services or commissioning construction projects from third parties. And it says how it can happen. First is contract management, which is the process of handling and carrying out the contract obligations. Again, as a takeaway, but just so that you can see the types of pre-contract and post-contract frauds risks there are. It's not just a matter of, oh, it's part of the tender process, or oh, it's, you know, the risk of someone offering an inducement to award a contract. Actually, there's a lot of different areas, both in the pre-contract award and post-contract management, where fraud can occur, and massive risks to organisations. But I also like to point out, and I want people to think about, you may not actually be in a position where you've had to manage a contract before, but I certainly have. And it was quite early on in my career, and I was responsible for managing a contract for a solution that we used for managing fraud cases. But I'd never been a contract manager before. I'd never been responsible for contract management. And these are the type of expected contract management skills that are placed on someone managing a contract. It's the terms and conditions, the planning of the delivery of the contract, the influence in persuasion, risk management, etc. This isn't just about your key performance indicators and making sure you're receiving what you're expecting. There's a whole host of areas that require specific skills, and frankly, our staff don't have those skills as a matter of course without the appropriate training. So there are other things that I'd like you to think about in today's session. And as I say, within the 500 odd participants that we're hopefully having today, we've got a great mixture of specialists, both procurement specialists and contract managers, but equally we've got some fraud professionals, and more importantly for me, we've got auditors that actually do attend quite a few of our procurement sessions. And for auditors, it's good to understand, you know, what to look out for, what controls should be in place, and what you should be looking for in order to offer a level of assurance to senior management, SMB, senior management board, etc. So it's great to have you as part of the session. But for me, again, I usually waffle on too much. I'm trying to manage time, but that's my 10-minute introduction to what we're here for today and who you're going to be speaking to and interacting with. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to pass you over to begin with to Mohammed, who will introduce himself and hopefully share any slides that he has. And Mohammed, you'll have 10 minutes that I'll have to manage, but hopefully we'll keep to time.
Thank you, Mark. Hope colleagues are
keeping well. I'm going to be talking about procurement fraud, and let me just share my screen with you first of all. In terms of today's subject, we're going to be talking about procurement fraud, contract management. These are major subjects, and we could be talking for days, if not a couple of weeks, on these subject matters, because they're very important kind of points. Procurement has become in the spotlight, especially since the pandemic, and we've got a new procurement bill going through Parliament at the moment. So there's a lot of focus spotlight on public procurement at the moment. Contract management, we've suffered from the let and forget syndrome for many years. So again, we can talk about the contract management for a long time. Just a quick introduction. Most colleagues will know I manage a procurement commission network, and colleagues can kind of contact me later on. We do have some events coming up, a full day event on contract management on the 30th of June in Leeds and 5th of July in London. So details are on the website. So moving on. And in terms of general fraud facts, procurement, as Mark highlighted, is very pernicious and can have a huge impact on organizations and employees. In today's fast-paced and increasingly complex corporate environment, procurement teams are trusted to make thousands of decisions that could significantly impact an organization's financial health and reputation. Most procurement teams take this responsibility very seriously and execute their roles ethically and legally. And as we saw during the pandemic, the public procurement colleagues played a vital and leading role in keeping public bodies operational. However, with such responsibility comes an increased risk of fraudulent behavior. And in terms of today's session, we'll try to cover some of the key areas or main areas or types of procurement fraud, how to identify it, and how to reduce the potential for procurement fraud in your own organization. And as Mark highlighted, there's a number of multiple ways that procurement fraud can take place. There's a variety of forms, from bid rigging, where suppliers collude with each other to increase prices or split contracts, bribery and kickbacks, payments or gifts are given to influence decisions, supply ethics, where organizations, companies have poor ethical and environmental practices. And at a time when we're focusing on climate change, these are all part of procurement fraud areas that we need to focus on. And as colleagues will know, in almost all areas of business life, organizations know what their costs are: employee costs, office costs, energy costs, etc. For centuries, these costs have been assessed and reviewed and measured to develop plans to reduce, to improve efficiencies as part of transformation plans. This incremental process now often delivers quite small additional improvements, but year in, year out, we get some improvements. But in terms of fraud, procurement fraud, we're not really exactly sure how much we can lose through procurement fraud. Now, in terms of the cost of fraud generally to the UK economy, it's a bit of an unknown, but it ranges from £20 billion to £137 billion. It could be a lot more, as nobody knows the exact figure. 1 in 9 organizations, according to various research, have experienced problems with fraud or procurement fraud. Unfortunately, Northwest and Southeast, according to some surveys, lead in terms of the fraud league. And when you look at some of the modus operandi of procurement fraud, there's usually somebody working inside the organization, and as well as somebody from a contractor's side, colluding together to try and see whether there's gaps in the processes. Now, very critically, according to some research that was conducted in Australia, 32% of suppliers said if they've had a perception that there's fraud or corruption taking place, they probably won't decide to bid for that contract. So it's very important that organizations have a very, very clean record in terms of anti-procurement measures, so that anti-procurement fraud measures, so that there's no reputation out there that this particular authority actually has faced a number of procurement fraud over the last couple of years, because it can actually have an impact in terms of how much competition you actually get. The public procurement purse, combined public procurement purse, is about £300 billion. So the question is, why go and rob a bank when there's £300 billion potentially at a fraudster's disposal or fraudster's opportunity? Now, in terms of procurement fraud, it's not something that's just happened during COVID. We've had £47 billion worth of contracts awarded during COVID. And it's estimated that there's 10 to 20% of those contracts could have some potential red flags. We've had some interesting National Audit Office reports, which I would recommend colleagues to read at their leisure. Some really interesting findings that we can incorporate into our own organisation. But we've got Sir Edward Coke, an Attorney General from Victorian Times. His famous words: "Fraud and deceit abound in these days more than in former times." I picked up a journal from 1860, actually. And you won't be able to read it on the screen, but it actually raises some really relevant and pertinent questions that we're probably asking ourselves today in terms of public sector contracts. It states that it's easy to say throw all government contracts out to public competition, but they had problems in those days in terms of specifying contracts, how shared contracts would be managed, concerns about incumbent suppliers expecting favourite treatment, monopolies, jobbing, red tapeism, negligence and corruption. And as I said, COVID, we've had some really interesting kind of discoveries, and I don't need to go into any detail in terms of what we've uncovered in terms of COVID, but it's a testimony in terms of local government, how fantastic local authorities have actually operated during the last couple of years, despite a new remote way of working. But it also raises the question, we've had traditional kind of controls in place in our authorities. We do need to check and update our procedures to make sure that the new way of working can actually accommodate good and effective controls to prevent or minimize the threat or risk of procurement fraud. Now, some of you who may be kind of interested in this area might want to kind of read up on Professor Cressy. He actually did he's a criminologist, wrote a PhD on this area, and his kind of famous fraud triangle is something that does actually kind of is very relevant. His kind of key areas kind of focus was on opportunity, pressure, also known as incentive or motivation, and rationalization. In terms of opportunity for fraudsters, if one is talking about theft, there must be something to steal. And I've mentioned we've got £300 billion public procurement purse. There's a huge amount of money which is open to a fraudster to take. If that fraudster identifies some weaknesses in the system, for example, lack of oversight, it may open the door for procurement fraud to take place. There's pressure. At the moment, we're living in a very high inflation, cost of living kind of pressures. And if there's any personal situations that can create a demand for more money, such as some well-known vices, which I can't mention because it's before 9 o'clock, or things like energy bills or food bills that could create a pressure environment, as well as rationalization. So these are the three kind of key kind of ways where a fraudster could actually rationalize their motive to actually commit procurement fraud in the organization. Quick kind of question, and you can use the Q&A just to get used to the Q&A. Can somebody tell me who this person is? Maybe just one or two people. Obviously everybody knows who this person is. So just in classic kind of have I got news for you? Anybody know who this person is? Probably making a lot of calls last night. Well, because of time issues, I'll be very, very quick. This is actually Trevor Rees-Mogg, who's actually in charge of public procurement now. He's the Brexit minister. And the famous kind of policy advisor, Dominic Cummings. And everybody will also know who this final person is, somebody who played very good tennis. But can somebody tell me which is the odd one out from a public procurement perspective? I'll just give you a couple of seconds because of time constraints, but there's an odd one out from a public procurement perspective? Well, the correct answer actually is Boris Becker, and most of you will know that he's actually recently been convicted of bankruptcy and other kind of related kind of convictions. Now, in terms of public procurement, first of all, you need to make sure that your suppliers are robust, because as part of your tendering processes, public authorities need to ask certain questions as part of the SQ document or the supplier kind of questionnaire in Scotland, and any economic operators or any directors or key persons in the organizations, if they've been convicted of any of these offences like conspiracy, corruption, bribery, money laundering, then there's a mandatory disqualification unless the supplier can actually show you self-cleansing kind of measures that they've undertaken. There can also be any discretionary grounds that includes bankruptcy, distortion of competition, and conflicts of interest. Now, I must say, even being a lawyer, some of these convictions are quite difficult to understand, but it's important that in terms of procurement officers, finance colleagues in the authority, do a robust financial assessment on suppliers to make sure that anybody with any dubious kind of record do not get through and be awarded public sector contracts. So those auditors on the webinar today, this is maybe an area that you need to just maybe focus on as part of your audit kind of investigations. Make sure that the authority is actually undertaking some robust kind of financial assessment of the supplier. This area is going to change. The procurement bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment, is looking at possibility of actually setting up a national debarment kind of register, as well as a single database where suppliers will need to actually get certification from. So in the future, this area is going to change quite dramatically. If things are able to actually be delivered in practice. So, do watch out for kind of changes in this area. But at the moment, until we get the new procurement bill, make sure that your kind of assessment of suppliers is robust. In terms of red flags, we can't go through every one in detail, but one area which I would encourage colleagues to look at is your contract procedure rules or standing orders, as well as your financial regulations. A lot has changed over the last couple of years, especially since COVID, to make sure that they have been updated. Most kind of contract procedure rules are required to be updated on an annual basis, but I have actually seen a number of these contract procedure rules, and I see many, a good majority of them are actually out of date, don't keep up to date with new legislative kind of changes. So make sure that your contract procedure rules are up to date, and also published on your website. There must be separation of duties, and as I said earlier, has COVID changed the way that you actually deliver your procurements, your contract management? If so, make sure it's properly recorded and your staff are fully aware of how things have actually changed. Look at tight tenders, cartels, collusive tendering, and data is going to be a big part of the procurement bill. So in the future, we expect a lot of analysis of procurement data to try to ensure that there's no cartels or monopolies operating. Most authorities, if not all authorities, will also have a contract register as well as a register of interest. Make sure that's been updated. There's no excessive entertainment of procurement staff by suppliers. If they take you out for a kind of sandwich lunch, that may be okay, but if they do take you out for a kind of a football match or FA Cups or somewhere else, then that may be something that needs to be kind of recorded, and your authority will have a policy whereby those things usually have to be rejected. Now, in terms of collusive tendering, we can look at that question later on, but in terms of collusive tendering, it's usually where suppliers get together, usually meet in a hotel somewhere, like we had some of the oil contracts many years ago, where the oil contractors met at Heathrow Airport and decided in terms of how to fix the price or what tenders they would actually bid at. So, Mark, I'll just be a couple of minutes to finish off, but other things to look at is in terms of, some of the areas in terms of each stage of your procurement could be at risk of some sort of a fraud. For example, when you identify the need, there may be no genuine requirement for your authority to go out to tender, but it could be actually something that just made up so that there's some sort of a kind of tender process, but the winner, the contractor who's going to be awarded the contracts, already determined beforehand. So auditors, again, I would encourage you to look at each stage of the procurement stage and therefore decide, in terms of how to investigate and make sure that the authority is robust. And finally, in terms of traditional kind of anti-fraud measures probably will not be satisfactory in the new age, the new technological age that we operate. So you need to look at a strategy for dealing with procurement fraud. So make sure you've got enough provisions related to deterrence, prevention, investigate where something does come up, do investigate and impose sanctions. So it's quite clear in the market, quite clear in terms of the public, that the authority will take a very, very robust kind of response to any kind of procurement fraud taking place, and make sure that you do try to recover as much money as possible. So that kind of concludes my session, and hand you over back to Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. It's very insightful. It's always interesting to see. Obviously, we put presentations together separately, but it's the overlap and the key messages that come out of it are quite interesting. I noticed that you had an article from 1600, or at least a snapshot from there, and it takes you back to the conversation about, well, when did fraud really come about? When did fraud become an offence? And I think we discussed this earlier. It wasn't until January of 2007 that the Fraud Act of 2006 was enacted, from the 1st of January 2007. And before that date, fraud was never an offence. It never really existed. It was always theft, false accounting, and other types of criminal activity that was encompassed in the theme of the phrase fraud. But also goes back to the first sort of reported attempt, which was was it 300 BC? It was a Greek cargo ship where someone took out insurance and falsely claimed that the ship had sunk after they'd removed all of their cargo at sea. So we're going back, thousands of years now for the risks to organisations that financial organisations face. Just a couple of things that come out of your session that I want to mention, not to cover now, but to prompt the discussion part a little later. Now, you talk about being able to debar someone from the procurement process. I think is going to be a massive tool in the armoury of an organisation. At the moment, I think there's only Scottish legislation that allows organisations to be ruled out for tender if they've got a criminal conviction, or if they don't have a criminal conviction. We'll go over that a little later. And you mentioned the council's constitution, the financial regulations, etc. And I think what I would like to point out and maybe discuss a little later is how you have to keep these up to date. Mohammed mentioned that some of them are not up to date. And for me, that's a key point. I do so many financial reviews under the financial management reviews that sit for do, where we find actual conflicts between the council's scheme of delegation that's set out in the financial regulations and the contract procedure rules, which actually have different figures that people can approve when they conflict against the approval levels within the scheme of delegation. And then there's the approval values that are automated within your systems to prevent fraud, controls that anything over £250, for instance, might have to go off for a second authorization. Things to look out for would be the approvals or the number of volume of payments and contracts and procurements at £249. Those type of things that you can look at. And for me, later, remind me about talking about where do responsibilities end. We've got a number of people on the call today that are procurement specialists. You're involved in the tendering exercise, you're trained, you've got qualifications in it and you specialize in it. But where does your responsibility end? Once the goods or the service have been procured and it's passed over to a contract manager in the service, does your responsibility end there? Do you follow up? Do you enable or support the contract managers in managing that contract to prevent post-tendering fraud? That would be helpful for us to understand what you do. Again, mindful of time, I'm going to pass over to Mike. And so Mike is Assistant Director of a service in Birmingham. He's recently moved services, so I'll let him introduce himself and explain. And we've done some really productive work with Birmingham recently around transactional services, and Mike will tell you a bit more about something that came out when a very simple administrative task has led to the prevention of some serious fraud attempts. So Mike, I'm going to pass you over for your 10 minutes. I'll keep an eye on the time. It's past, so it'll give you until 22.
Okay, thanks Mark, and good afternoon all, and welcome. You can see my background to the Commonwealth Games hosting city of Birmingham. As you can probably tell, it's not the part of the country that I actually come from myself, but it's a wonderful city, and I encourage you to come and visit us sometime in the near future. So, fraud. I'm going to start this little discussion with a reminder about housekeeping, and it's hard to overemphasize just how important good housekeeping is. And Mohammed earlier mentioned data. And in Birmingham, now Birmingham, biggest metropolitan authority in Europe, we have a budget in excess of 1.5 billion. We offer our various customers something like 2,000 separate services. So that, it is a big marketplace. And of course, one of the big problems we have is understanding who we are dealing with, both in terms of suppliers and customers. So one of the things that we've done in Birmingham, one of the innovative things, that we've created a team called Data Validation. And what that team do is act as a gateway into our systems for suppliers and customers. Every supplier account, every customer account goes through the opening process and is controlled by data validation. That means that we don't have things like duplicate accounts. when I first went to Birmingham, we had an instance where we had 20 separate accounts for one organisation. And that was simply because of naming conventions not being applied and no central ownership of the data. So that's, that at the earliest stage, that's one of the top tips that I would give everyone, particularly in the public sector, that you should have a controlled, centralized route into your systems. And that allows you to then begin to do some of the kind of clever things that we might do to prevent fraud. Now, in Birmingham, we have a really quite kind of open, transparent view of how our staff should operate. We genuinely do empower people. I worked for a year as the head of transaction services, responsible for accounts receivable, accounts payable, payroll, and some other areas. So some very, very large spending parts of the council. I've now moved over. I'm the assistant director for Send Transport, which transports children with special educational needs or disabilities to school and from school to home and in various other journeys. You might wonder why somebody who has 25 years experience of credit control and credit management, fraud prevention, could end up running a school transport service. And the answer is simple. It's a transactional service, and it had been identified that there was certainly a potential for fraud. And so they wanted someone to come in to run that service that had that background. And that was a bit of an eye-opener for me, because I certainly didn't expect it. But also, I think for everyone here in the room, it tells you that having the right understanding of fraud, having the right understanding of transactions is really important right across the breadth of an organization. Excuse me. So in the future, I think you'll find that people who come from a transactional background will be spread throughout organizations, because it is our experience in this area that can make a difference. And I don't know how many of you would recognize a horrible piece of legislation called the Local Government Transparency Agenda. I think it was probably originally written by somebody who was trying to commit fraud and wanted a bit of help. But it's basically a piece of legislation that requires that every public sector organization publishes on a regular basis details of all payments over £500 made to anyone. So literally, if you know where to go, you can go off and find details of every payment over £500 that Birmingham has ever made. And you can imagine, with a budget of 1.5 billion per annum, we've made an awful lot of payments over £500. And like many public sector organizations, in our desire to meet the requirements of the transparency agenda, we over-published information. We put out reams of stuff that we didn't need to do. And just to make it super easy for the fraudster, we not only publish details of the names of organizations and values of payments that we made, but we also helpfully put their account number on the publication, so that fraudsters had access to some really core data. So what did we do? How did we reduce the risk of fraud in Birmingham? And what would I recommend that you do? When you are publishing data through the LGTA, or indeed in any other forum where you have to make this kind of information available, stop using the account number that is relevant within your system and create an entirely fictitious one using a different format, something that is so obviously not one of your account numbers, but it is the reference used for that supplier in that public forum, or that particular transaction in that public forum. And quite simply, what it means when someone contacts your organization and says that they want to update the email account, or they want to change the phone number, the bank details, all the usual mandate fraud, when they quote that fictitious reference number, you know it's fraud. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to carry out an investigation. The transaction is suspect there and then. So that's what we did in Birmingham. We introduced this fictitious reference, and we used it with the publication. You don't have to put an account number out there, but we chose to, and of course we chose to make it a reference that we could use for fraud. Did it work? Oh yes, it certainly did. Within a matter of weeks of the new process, or the new publication being done, we identified 2 attempted frauds. They were not connected, although they were only a week apart. And through the intervention of our counter fraud team, because it's important that you work with the right organizations within your own business, we managed to identify the individuals concerned, shut down 31 bank accounts that were associated with those individuals, capturing significant sums of money, it has to be said. And 2 files are now being processed by West Midlands Police, and hopefully will lead to the successful prosecution of the individuals involved. Now, I emphasize, all we did was removed an actual reference and replaced it with a dummy reference. But that dummy reference was the key to us understanding that someone was attempting to defraud us at the earliest opportunity. Now, you might ask what we've learned from it. You know, what we've learned is that okay, for a while, we're ahead of the game. We're ahead of the people who perpetrate these kind of frauds. The reality is, by coming to an event like this and being open and telling you about this, I'm actually creating a certain degree of risk. There could be somebody on this call who's here because they want to find out how to commit fraud. Might sound stupid, but believe me, that's the world we live in. So one of the things that came across to me through this is that the attention to detail, the repetitive, the almost boring, getting your data right, naming conventions, having people checking when account amendments are made, all of this is really critical. It's the nuts and bolts of not only preventing fraud, but stopping it. I think one of the big things that happened in Birmingham during this process was I had this oddball character called Mark Macaulay appear from SITFA. And Mark, as many of you will know, is quite a unique character and speaks plainly, which meant that he and I got on very well. But when we started discussing the changes that had been made in Birmingham and the really positive effect it had on fraud, we then started to talk about it from a SITFA perspective and how things like that could be promoted outside of our organization. And further, we then decided that we were going to get Mark to look into other areas of our organization to see if there were other obvious weaknesses in areas where we could make improvements. So we've had, almost by chance, we've been very lucky to have this kind of developed relationship with SITFA. That means that we can be quite open about things that we've done and the benefits that we've gained, and they can take that out and take it out into the marketplace, if you like. Now, I could talk for hours about cases of fraud and things that I've seen and things that have been stopped over the years. I'm going to give you guys a break, and I think I've just about hit my 10 minutes. Happy to answer any questions later in the conversation.
You have indeed. Thanks, Mike. And one of the reasons, obviously, we invited Mike along was that in sharing that story it shows how something as simple as an administrative task, someone making a decision that actually it's not best practice to share all of your information, the identifying information and the more serious information, if it gets out in the public domain, can create a risk. By not sharing that, by changing it and putting something in that actually enables you to identify red flags easier, is simple but effective. Not only is it effective in the sense that it's prevented fraud, sometimes it's always difficult to measure what you've prevented. I know in these instances you can take, as Mike said in a conversation we had earlier, you can take an average spend for that supplier that was being targeted, and even on one of those payments it amounted to about 5 million, I think you said earlier, Mike. Yeah. In order to measure it. But something that effective means that one, fraud didn't take place, it didn't occur, the authority didn't lose any money, they didn't pay anything out, there was no loss, there is no expense in trying to detect who's done it, investigate, sanction, and then try and recover any losses. So all of those savings have been front-ended by a simple administrative task of changing that transparency data. And if there are things in different departments that are fraud risks that could have something as simple as what you've done to change what you do and how you do it to prevent fraud, that becomes invaluable to an organization. I do like the idea around the data validation team, and that's something that we've previously discussed, because there is a value to your data in the data that an organization holds internally. Being able to use that to match against other types of data to identify risks and identify fraud is of an extreme value. But if you've got bad data, poor data, it diminishes the value of what you're trying to do. So having good data is key to any good data matching exercises and fraud prevention efforts. We do have a question, Mike, in our Q&A that actually I'm going to pose to you. It's from somebody called Kimberly. She says, with budget cuts throughout many local authorities, have you noticed an increase in procurement fraud due to these cuts? And could it be procurement teams are being underfunded, etc.?
Mark, really good question. Short answer is yes. There is definitely a recognition that if there are not more attempts, there are more attempts that are being seen. There is, in the procurement world, this desire to move to what they call no PO, no pay. Lovely idea, lovely concept, very difficult to actually deliver. And I'm finding that one of the most common problems is that the procurement teams are simply not big enough to do the kind of jobs that they have to do. And I'm sure Mohammed on his side of the fence will say the same thing, that it's very difficult to persuade an organization that there is benefit to soft value, and procurement is soft value. Doing it right produces great value for an organization, but the benefits are maybe not as visible as they could be, so therefore getting the investment is difficult.
Okay, thank you. I'm trying to go through all of the Q questions so that we can form a discussion. An old colleague, Oliver Staplinski, has posed the question. He says, well, he's made a point, first of all, that those that manage contracts in the public sector may not be from procurement teams. They won't have the skill sets required to manage contract or fraud risk effectively. And it may be down to resource struggles and therefore not having the capacity to follow protocol. I'd add to that and say that they're also out in the wider working world, in the departments. They're not necessarily reporting to procurement specialists within a procurement team. So the level of knowledge, skills, experience is diminished the further down the chain that the responsibility for contract management goes to. Now, I'm not I'm not casting aspersions on contract managers and those responsible. Some of them may be absolutely amazing. But even those that are absolutely amazing, I would argue, probably haven't been provided with the full skill set, training, knowledge and experience that they need to do their job effectively. So when Oliver asks what support can be offered to these individuals, I'm going to ask Mohammed to respond to that. I would say, obviously, training is of paramount. If you've got good training and knowledge that can be passed to these individuals that are responsible, that's great. It actually, procurement has become part of the bedrock of the apprenticeship as well. It forms one of the modules in the apprenticeship scheme for any counter fraud professional. So it's now being embedded in training that's being delivered for counter fraud specialists. But we're talking about, and Oliver's talking about, contract managers. What support can be offered to those individuals in the organisations, Mohammed?
I think this is a very interesting question.
And I think you need to take the holistic approach to this. I think we've had a number of procurement strategies which in the past have recommended that authorities have a procurement or contract management champion in the organisation, somebody at the top table, a director who's actually responsible for the contracts in the authority. Very few authorities, unfortunately, still have that. And I think that's a must in my view. Somebody at the top table must have some responsibility, ownership of the contracts that the authority has, some awareness of what the contracts are. I think it's also important that in terms of resources, I do fully agree that a lot of authorities have don't have the capacity at the moment, or the experience capacity to engage in both procurement and contract management. These are both specialized fields. You just can't get any apprentice to come and deliver procurement. Authorities enter into some very, very complex transactions. Ideally, in an ideal world, you'd expect the contract managers to be involved in the procurement cycle. So from the outset, when the decision is made to actually go out to tender, the commissioning phase, and have some awareness of what the contract's all about. Because the last thing that you want is a contract to be handed over. It's like a baby, just you take over. Both parties have to be involved. The procurement team and the contract managers have to have ongoing discussions during the procurement phase, as well as during the contract management phase. So that's the lessons learned can be taken on board. So when it comes to a new contract, the next generation contract, that can all the learnings can be taken into account. Unfortunately, that doesn't take place in many organizations. And I think we do really need to change in the future to make sure that we're all working together to improve our tenders, making sure we get best value for the taxpayer.
Yeah, we've got one of the participants, Paul, has said that contract management investment in skills development is essential. Without this, doors open to all types of fraud risks. I think, yeah, we certainly would agree with that. The fact that they've tried to address this as a local authority might be an exception. I think that, yeah, with limited budgets, limited resources, I think, there is a lack of training in specialist contract management, but it's of paramount importance. And I think there's also, when I said earlier around procurement specialist, when does your responsibility end? There's a mixed delivery model in organisations. Some do have a role within the procurement team responsible for overview of the contract management and reporting back on performance and stuff. So that's quite key, but in others, there's absolutely none. So I'm just trying to go through these. Somebody has asked, any tips for engaging local police and action fraud? Because in their experience, it's hard to get them to investigate. Even small frauds could be the start of a potential career criminal's journey. So yes, that's true. And actually, one of our participants has sort of started to answer that already. They've said you're lucky if you get the police interested. LA fraud teams sometimes don't have the capacity to investigate mandate fraud, prevented mandate fraud. Definitely, I agree that. Where it's referred to the police, you usually just get an acknowledgement that you've recorded it and it's been reported. And obviously action fraud love that for reporting purposes, but that's a stop reply. It doesn't get investigated. There's no obvious leads. And despite them having a bank account into which a fraudster's wanted paying. Now, I fully appreciate that. I think we're opening a minefield if we try and discuss that now. What I will go back to is, Mike, on your one, you mentioned on those two individuals, you managed to get 31 bank accounts shut down. Yeah. So although you might not be able to go off and tackle these fraudsters and catch them and take sanction action, you've managed to close down 31 of the bank accounts that they're using, not just for your mandate fraud, but elsewhere in other organisations.
I think actually, Mark, there's two elements to this. Yes, one, we managed to shut down 31 bank accounts associated with the two individuals involved. There was a significant sum captured from those accounts, which obviously had been effectively money laundered. And obviously, no one has actually admitted what the exact figure is, although they keep saying it's a significant figure. I think the crux was because we moved so quickly, so we knew that the fraud was being committed before the fraudster had half a chance to work out that they'd been caught. So we managed to identify the bank account, get to the banks, notify the banks in the correct format. So the banks had to act. And what we were left with was a neat package of the individual involved, the bank accounts that we're using, the values, the potential loss, that we could just hand straight across from our counter fraud team to the local police. Now, I recognise not all police forces will act the same way, but in a lot of cases, if you hand them a nice, easy conviction with a bow wrapped around the box, they'll take it.
Yeah, I mean, we just in general investigation work, when you package something together nicely, they're more amenable to receiving and running through and allocating someone. So it is how it's packaged. But again, that's down to individual organisational resources, and some organisations, especially the bigger ones with the scale of Birmingham's budget, probably experience more mandate fraud attempts than others, and the police literally wouldn't have the resources themselves to take them fraud. So yes, it's frustrating, and it's not something that I think we'll ever have an answer for. There are a couple of questions while back still with you, Mike. It would be helpful. There seems to be quite a bit of interest around the data validation team. Around, does it validate data in the payable systems, or does it go beyond, i.e. receivable, payroll, transport, travel subsistence, etc., and care, which is a big one. And someone else has asked about the checks to do when onboarding new customers and suppliers. So I'm going to ask, is there anything that you can share, just a summary of what you did and how you did it with me, that we can then share with the participants with the slides, perhaps?
I think what I would say is all data related to customer and supplier. So all the naming convention stuff, the addresses, phone numbers, emails, email strings, all that stuff, all has to go through central validation, and a set of rules apply to ensure that you use the same conventions yourself. What we found, and this was very much part because of the work that you and I had done previously, Mark, not every circumstance is the same. Yes, we have payroll, we have accounts payable, we have accounts receivable. We put all of those accounts through data validation. But we also do checks against payroll to make sure that there isn't an obvious insider fraud. That it depends how much that you want to do. I'm lucky I work with an organization where they are really happy to do these kind of out of the left field kind of things to help prevent fraud. Some organizations may not be. What I would encourage participants in this call to do is, if you want to know more about the data validation and how it might work with your organization, contact Mark. He was very helpful with me in terms of what we wanted to do at Birmingham. And whilst I would love to be able to answer individual queries, I'm kind of busy at Birmingham with a lot of kids to transport. So I recommend
maybe
having it.
maybe we can do a follow-up and just do something that we can share with all the participants. I'll look into that. I'm just mindful I'm trying to cover all of the questions, so no more questions please. I'll try and get through these ones. Someone asked, Angela asked around, would any of the aspects of the investigation into Grenfell fire regarding materials used for the building construction, safe check suppliers, constitute procurement fraud? And I'm going to say yes. I think it's public information. If you were to Google it, you'll find that the fire safety equipment that was installed at Grenfell by the company called Lake House was incorrectly installed. I think it was part of a regeneration scheme of 180, 200 million pound by Hackney Homes. And as a result of what was found, obviously post-event, which is tragic and too late, was that there was fraud, overcharging, bribery, other obvious fraud-related offences, and I think that's led to a number of convictions and a statement from the mayor that every council should carefully check the work that has been carried out. But this goes back around, whose responsibility is that? Is that a contract manager who's responsible for managing a contract and some key performance indicators? Are they expected to go out on site and inspect fire safety equipment that they have no knowledge of? They don't know how it's meant to work, how it's meant to be installed. They're the type of nuances that you're dealing with. And then another comment that was made around, well, is it possible to identify organisations that are bidding and remove them from the process? And a colleague, Patrick, has shared, it's excluding a tenderer is not easy. Mandatory exclusion for offences under the Companies Act or Fraud Act means that the body corporate must have a conviction, and you'll find it dead difficult to find a body corporate that's had a conviction that would exclude them. And if you were to discretionary exclude, you'd find that anyone that is tendering that gets excluded on a discretionary basis would probably be suing your organisation. So that's it's difficult. There are some questions that I haven't been able to go through that we will try and follow up afterwards. Someone has asked generally, Matt Hedford, my former boss, I presume, do local authorities provide anti-fraud and anti-corruption awareness training to procurement staff and other key staff in finance and payroll? That's something that we at SITFA certainly advocate. I think Mike is saying no. I do know of general fraud awareness that might be an online half an hour, not very interactive session that staff take upon induction. But I haven't seen too many organisations that have anti-fraud and corruption general awareness training throughout the entirety of their staff. We SITFA obviously do offer bespoke procurement, fraud training and other training to finance staff, but so it's a bit of a mixed bag, I'm afraid, Matt, there. Other questions, as I say, we'll take away. I'll wrap up by saying thank you to Mohammed and Mike for participation in this session. Thank you to those in the background that have helped organise the session and keep us all on time and get us connected. With over 400 odd participants, I think it's been a very good session. We will certainly look at what we can take away in response to some of the questions that have remained unanswered, but also in what follow-up sessions that we can roll out on the back of this. I'd like to thank you all for participating and joining today. My contact details will be on the slide deck that we will share. But again, we are now at 1 o'clock. Thank you for spending your lunchtime with SITFA and our colleagues, Mohammed and Mike. And as I say, any feedback would be greatly appreciated. My email will be on the slides, but thank you very much for your attendance. Thanks all.